بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Welcome everybody to the second session for our course on the Islamic foundations of the early Ottoman Empire. Inshallah, today what we're going to do is we're going to really start to get into the early history of the empire. I know that last week kind of teased at the empire quite a bit because we had to focus a lot on the background that underpins the foundations of the empire itself. So we talked about the Mongols, we talked about the Abbasids, we talked about this idea of the Khilafah. All of these are necessary things for us to understand before we start talking about the Ottomans. Very often, when people start thinking about the Ottoman Empire and understanding its history, they imagine this continuous line of Muslim political rulership that begins with Abu Bakr and ends with the fall of the Ottoman Empire in 1922 and the end of the Ottoman Khilafah in 1924. But it's really not that simple. And the more that you study Muslim history, the more you realize that it's not a very clean picture necessarily. I hope that we saw some of that last week, just looking at the different maps that we took a look at. I mean, you have all of these different polities that are constantly warring against each other, some of them Muslim, some of them non-Muslim. You have different governments that overlap with each other in different manners at different times. So it's not as simple as saying we had the Rashidun and then the Umayyads and then the Abbasids and then the Ottomans. So one thing that we emphasized last week that I think that we need to mention again before we get into our session today is to remember that history is cyclical. So we talked about Ibn Khaldun, the great 14th, 15th century historian, Maliki Qadi, sociologist, economist. I hope that if you have an opportunity, you can take a look at his Muqaddimah. It's written in beautiful Arabic if you can read Arabic. If you can't read Arabic, it's been translated into a ton of European languages. It's definitely been translated into French and English. The English edition is by Franz Rosenthal, and it's fairly good, although it can be kind of wordy in some places because it was translated 60, 70 years ago now. It's been translated into Turkish, I would assume in Urdu and Persian as well. But one of his signature theories is that every state has a natural lifespan. And he estimates that that lifespan is around 100-ish years. We see this with the Umayyads, who are founded by Muawiyah, the Sahabi of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It is founded, and then it has its growth and its golden age, if you will, and then it falls around 90 years, 91 years after Muawiyah founds it in the year 661 CE. With the Abbasids, we see a similar trend, although theirs kind of takes a little bit longer, especially if you look at the history of Al-Andalus, the history of Muslim Spain. We see dynasties lasting almost exactly 100 years. The Murabitun lasts pretty much 100 years. The ones who overthrow them and succeed them, the Muwahidun movement, they last about 100 years. The Nasrids last a little bit longer in southern Spain, as well as the Marinids. But the cycle is still there. We have this cycle of regeneration of Muslim polities throughout Islamic history. And as we saw last week, I'm going to pull up the images here. There we go. So here we're taking a look at the same map that we looked at last week, the Mongols who pop up in the early 13th century. They are united pretty much in the year 1206 by Chinggis Khan. As we know, they conquer a huge portion of the known world to them. Actually, they really conquer more than what is even known to them when they get started. 1258, however, under Hulagu Khan, we have a destruction of Baghdad. And this is important not just because Baghdad is a major city, but because it fundamentally changes the way that political legitimacy is understood in the Muslim world. Previously, in order to be considered a legitimate ruler, you had to have a letter of investiture from the Abbasid Khalifa. So I mentioned, for example, last week, Yusuf ibn Tashfin, all the way in Al-Andalus, he sends a letter to the Abbasid Khalifa asking for permission to rule, saying, you know, I have conquered all of this land. I am the sultan of these people. I just want permission from the Abbasid to rule. Without that permission, you are technically illegitimate. Without the Abbasids now, after the year 1258, that whole notion is out of the window, right? It doesn't exist anymore. Yes, there is a Abbasid, a shadow Abbasid Khilafah in Cairo under the control of the Mamluks, but they are pretty much unrecognized anywhere in the Muslim world. Very, very few exceptions where individuals do send a letter to Cairo asking for permission to rule. But by and large, after 1258, everything has changed. Now, one of the things that we see in Muslim history and Muslim civilization is that Muslim civilization is by nature very flexible. And we are capable of adapting to a number of different contexts, whether it's historical, geographic, or political. This is why we see that Islam thrives in Muslim Spain for 700 plus years, and it thrives in Malaysia starting in the 1200s and lasting till today, right? And it thrives obviously in Arabia, thrives in the Indian subcontinent. So whatever the political situation or the geographic or cultural situation that Muslims find themselves in, our deen allows us a certain level of creativity in being able to deal with whatever kind of context we find ourselves in. So in the post-Mongol context now, one thing that's really unique about this time period is, yes, we are going to adapt. Things are going to change. There's no Abbasid Khilafah anymore. We need to find new forms of political legitimacy. But there are two main regions where we find this creativity really taking root and leading to a new rise of powerful Muslim governments and powerful Muslim cultures and civilizations. Number one is what we are talking about in this course, which is the Ottomans. And if you look at this map, notably, let me pull up here we go, the laser pointer. So the Ottomans are going to get started right over here. You can see the laser pointer right at the edge of where it says Seljuks of Rum. We're going to talk about the Seljuks in just a minute. The Ottomans are able to establish a new order, a new political order with new notions of political legitimacy in the borderlands of the Muslim world. All right, over here, we're talking about Christian Europe. We are talking about lands where it says Byzantine Empire, Bulgaria, Serbia, Hungary. Those are lands that have never been under the control of Muslims. If you know a little bit about the history of the city of Constantinople, which is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, Muslims did in fact try to besiege that city very early on in Muslim history. And we have the famous story of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, who was famous, among other reasons. One of the reasons he's famous is because when the Prophet ﷺ migrated to Medina, he stayed in his house. And Abu Ayyub participated in every battle that happened during his life, unless if he was partaking in another battle somewhere else. So if there was a possibility for him to be at a battle, he was there. And when he was very old, either in his 90s or his 100s, he actually went with the Muslim expedition to conquer the city of Constantinople. He died during that siege, and he was buried near the walls of Constantinople. We're going to see next week, when the Ottomans besieged the city in 1453, they find, the legend goes at least, that they find the grave of Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, and you can go there today, and the grave is there, and there's a beautiful masjid next to it. The Turks refer to him as Ayyub Sultan. They don't refer to him, they think of him as like the first Ottoman, interestingly enough. So that's one area that we see. We see over here in the West a flowering of a new Muslim order. On the other side of the Muslim world, over here we have the Delhi Sultanate. Now the Delhi Sultanate is founded in the early 1200s by another Mamluk dynasty, separate from the Mamluks in Cairo. But we are going to see in the 1500s the foundation of the Mughal Empire. And the Mughal Empire, the reason that it's called the Mughal Empire is because they are descendants essentially of Turco-Mongol warlords from Central Asia. Babur, Muhammad Babur in 1526 at the Battle of Panipat, conquers the Delhi Sultanate and establishes this new Timurid-based dynasty in South Asia. And these are going to be the two major dynasties, the two major states of the early modern Muslim world. And what I want to point out here a little bit is the geographic location of these two new dynasties, right? They are on the edge. These are areas where there is a lot of fertile ground, we can say, for Muslims to establish something totally new. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit, a little bit later today, when we talk about the establishment of Ottoman institutions, particularly the idea of the madrasa, and how the fact that the Ottomans were in a new context, a new geographic context, allowed them to do something that hadn't really happened previously with regards to the operation of the madrasa in the Muslim world. Before we get to that, though, we need to talk a little bit about the Seljuks. So a quick overview of who the Seljuks are. The Seljuks are a group of Turks from Central Asia. So all those Stan countries, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, that's the traditional homeland of the Turkic peoples. They start to convert to Islam around the 800s, 900s, 1000s CE. They migrate into the central heartland of the Muslim world. And at one point we have, in the year 1050, the establishment of what's known as the Great Seljuk Empire. So this is an empire that is run by Turks. The ruling family are Turks. Most of the bureaucrats and the government officials are Persian. So there's this kind of melding together of Turkish and Persian civilization. In fact, if anyone knows anything about Persian culture, the most notable work of literature in Persian history is the Shahnameh, right? The Story of Kings, written by Firdausi in the 11th century. And he actually wrote it, it's about Persian history. It really glorifies Persian history, really at the expense of everybody else. But he writes it for a Turkish Sultan, Mahmud of Ghazna. So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship between the Turks and the Persians that begins very early on, and it continues through the Seljuks. Now, the Seljuks, when they convert to Islam in the 10th century, they you can kind of think of them as Muslim samurais in that they are known for warfare. That's kind of their thing. That's the main reason why the Abbasids even reach out to the Turks in Central Asia starting in the 9th century. And when they convert to Islam, they're kind of like a loose arrow that just kind of needs to be pointed in any particular direction. So you can kind of imagine that these people convert to Islam and they say, okay, well, who do we fight against? We're Turks, we're from Central Asia, we ride on horseback. It used to be said, in fact, that if a Turk wanted to travel more than 10 feet, he would get on his horse. Like they're horse-based people to that extent. And when they're not sitting on their horses, they actually would walk bow-legged because of how their bodies have kind of adjusted to be on horseback all day. So you can think of them and imagine them as this very effective fighting force. Now, the traditional enemy that has always, on and off, we can say, been at war with the Muslim world is the Byzantine Empire. Now, a little bit of clarity here. When we talk about the Byzantines, we use the term Byzantines today to refer to them. They are essentially the Roman Empire, okay? The Roman Empire, which begins with Augustus Caesar in the aftermath of the assassination of his stepfather, Julius Caesar. I think we all probably are a little bit familiar with that history. So that starts around the year, in the 1st century, so a little bit after the year 0 CE. And by around 500, the Roman Empire mostly collapses in the West. The eastern part of the Roman Empire does survive. We today refer to that as the Byzantine Empire just for the purposes of being able to differentiate between the early Romans, talking about people like Caesar and Marcus Aurelius and Caligula and Nero, and the later Romans who are going to live all the way until the year 1453, spoiler alert, when they're conquered by the Ottoman Empire. So this Byzantine Empire has been at war with Muslims literally since the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? Now, most of the Byzantine lands in the Middle East are conquered during either the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam or the rightly guided Khilafah, particularly under the rule of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Places like Syria over here, right? The borderlands over here, what's now Iraq, and particularly Egypt, are conquered during the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab. And then North Africa, countries like Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, those areas are conquered by the Umayyads from the Byzantines. All right, so the Byzantines have this huge loss of land very early on in Muslim history, but they stick around. I mentioned the siege. There was actually a number of different sieges early on of the Umayyads trying to conquer the city of Constantinople, in which Abu Ayyub al-Ansari took part, but they were unsuccessful. So the Byzantine Empire does survive. One of the reasons that it survives is, this is not a geographic map, so you can't see this on this map right here, but Anatolia, what we now refer to as Turkey, that area is very mountainous. So whereas Syria and Egypt, those are relatively flat lands, where the Umayyad armies, which were heavily based on camels, could very easily kind of roam into these areas and conquer it from the Byzantines and keep it. The mountainous area of Anatolia was a little bit more difficult. In fact, one of the things that the Seljuks do that makes them capable of conquering Anatolia is they breed Bactrian camels with dromedary camels. Bactrian camels are the two-hump camels that come from Central Asia, and dromedaries are the one-hump camels that you find in the Arabian Peninsula. I promise I'm not going to go too much into the camel biology here, mostly because I'm not qualified to talk about it. Also, it can get kind of a bit much, but it actually is very interesting. There's a very interesting book by Richard Bullitt about the role of the camels in Muslim history. It's a fascinating book. It's all about camels. Anyways, what the Seljuks do is they actually breed dromedaries with Bactrians, and that creates a hybrid camel that is actually capable of going up into the mountains of Anatolia and conquering that land. The important thing that you should know is 1071. There's this battle, the Battle of Manzikert. This is a major battle in which the Seljuks just completely destroy the Byzantine army. They actually capture the Byzantine emperor, and then later allow him to go back to Constantinople. After 1071, most of what's now Turkey begins to be colonized. We shouldn't use the word colonized, that's a very modern term, but it begins to be settled by Turks. Now, one thing that's really important that we need to, well, two things I think that are really important that we need to take from this. Number one, a question that people very often have with regards to the Seljuks conquering Anatolia, as well as in general Muslim conquests of non-Muslim lands, is what gives Muslims the right to conquer these areas, right? Anatolia, before the Turks got there, mostly spoke Greek. There are, of course, Armenians, as you can see over here, Cilician Armenia, as well as a number of other ethnic and linguistic groups that exist in Anatolia. But somebody might say, well, if that area is ruled by Greeks, right, the Byzantine Empire speaks Greek, most of the population is Greek, how could the Turks possibly just go and invade that land and claim it for themselves? So that line of thinking is purely based on a very modern mindset with regards to international relations and borders and things like that. Last week we talked about, well, I used the US invasion of Iraq in 2003 as an example. I'm going to use that as an example again in a different way this week. If you remember, in 2003, George Bush and the Bush administration had to make a legal case at the United Nations for why the United States has a right, not just a want, not just a need, but a right to invade Iraq. Now, before the United Nations, before the League of Nations, which comes into being after World War I, really before even the Peace of Augsburg in the 16th century, nobody would have ever asked that question, right? Empires went to war with one another. That was simply the way that international relations operated, right? And when you look at the early Muslim conquests of, most of what we're seeing on this map over here, lands from Egypt all the way to Iran and the borders of the Indian subcontinent, we have a lot of accounts of people, non-Muslims, who are now living under, who witnessed the Muslim conquest and are now living under Muslim rule. And in many cases, they're very kind of ticked off, right? Saying, I liked it better when the Christians like me were in charge and now the Muslims are in charge and things like that, whatever. But nobody is complaining about the Muslims, overstepping the bounds of international law of that time. That concept simply does not exist. It's not until the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics in the 16th and 17th century in Europe that we start to have these notions of borders, right? Today, you can't change a border just by conquering it, right? Even if you look at Google Maps, for example, this is an interesting exercise to do. You look at Crimea. Last time I looked at Crimea, which is actually this little peninsula in the northern part of the Black Sea, you're going to see red borders around it because Russia conquered it from the Ukraine a few years ago, but that was an illegal conquest according to international law. The United Nations never recognized it. Ukraine doesn't recognize it. So yes, if you go there today, you're going to find a bunch of Russian flags, but the rest of the world does not recognize that. They say this is against the way that things are done now. We have borders, and those borders cannot be transgressed. That is a modern concept. Nobody at the time of the Seljuks or of at the time of the Umayyads or the Ottomans or anybody would have really cared about this notion of international rights. It simply did not exist until the modern era. So this question of what gives Muslims the right to conquer Anatolia or conquer any land from other people kind of misses the point. A second thing that we can take from the Battle of Manzikert here is that I mentioned this area over here of Anatolia today is by far mostly Turkish speaking. It is mostly Muslim. But actually 100 years ago, there was quite a few Greeks that still lived there. We tend to think of countries as being homogenous today. So we have Arab countries that speak Arabic and everybody there is an Arab. We have the country of Turkey, which is for the Turks. We have the country of Iran, which is for the Iranians, for the Persians. But that's a very modern notion of nationalism that is based on historical fictions. The idea that every language group has a traditional ancestral homeland that they belong to, and that land belongs to them. And nobody can abrogate that at any point in history. So it's a very, again, it's a very modern concept that really has no basis in history. And especially in the case of the Ottoman Empire, we see throughout almost all of Ottoman history, the vast majority of the Ottoman population does not speak Turkish and they are not Muslim. And yet the empire functions. And every group within the empire, be they Greeks or Armenians or Turks or Arabs or Persians or Bulgarians or Bosnians or Albanians, all of them are part of this empire. Nobody thought of it as a Turkish empire until modern nationalism kind of gets in the way. So anyways, this area over here, the Anatolia, is now part of a state known as the Seljuks of Rum. Rum here obviously coming from the word Romans, because this land was known as Rum, because it was initially part of the Roman Empire, which again we refer to as the Byzantine Empire. That's why, for example, Jalal ad-Din al-Rumi, who's actually born all the way over here in Balkh, he's a Persian Sufi and poet. I think everybody probably knows about him. He travels all the way over to Konya, and he is then known as Rumi because he lives in the land of Rum. Now, after the Mongols conquer the region, they shatter Seljuk authority in Anatolia, all right, in the late 13th century. So the Seljuks, they still exist as a ruling family, but they're not really, again, the political order has fundamentally changed. There are now a bunch of new Turkish beys. A bey, B-E-Y, is like a chief. So a beylik is a chiefdom, we can say. There is a bunch of beyliks all over Anatolia now. The one that we are interested in, of course, is the Ottomans up here in the northwestern part of Anatolia. The word Ottoman is derived from a mispronunciation of the word Osman, or the name Osman, which is itself a Turkish mispronunciation of the Arabic name Uthman. That is the name of the traditional founder of the Ottoman Empire. And he was a Turkish bey. He was a Turkish chief. He's not a sultan. He's just some guy on the borderlands. And we'll get to his relationship to the Ottoman Empire in just a minute. But first, we have to talk about a really important chapter that really is the opening chapter of Ottoman history. And this is a story in which Osman was spending the night at his sheikh's house. His sheikh's name was Edebali, Sheikh Edebali. So while Osman is sleeping, he has a dream. In this dream, a tree sprouts out from his chest. and the branches and leaves of this tree reach out into the sky and kind of provide shade for the entire world. And the roots of this tree are so big that they actually go all the way into Europe, all the way into Asia, and all the way into Africa. So when Osman wakes up from this dream, he goes to his sheikh Edebali, and he tells him his dream. And Edebali was known as one who interprets dreams. As you may know, I mean, dream interpretation is a real science where there are ulama, there are scholars of dream interpretation that you can go to who will be able to interpret the symbolism in your dream and be able to tell you what it actually means. So Sheikh Edebali was one of these people. Osman goes to him and he says, what does this dream mean? And the Sheikh tells him that from your progeny, there's going to be an empire that is going to rule over the Europeans, the Asians, and the Africans. And his Sheikh tells him, I want my own progeny to be part of that as well, so I want you to marry my daughter. So Osman marries the daughter of his Sheikh Edebali. Now, at the time of Osman, something that we need to understand about the context here so that we can understand the importance of this story. This is the borderlands of the Muslim world, right? In fact, this area over here along the Aegean and Black Sea coast really had only just now started to come under the control of these Turkish chiefs. So there are no major Muslim cities here. There is no great Islamic intellectual heritage here or anything like that, right? You can imagine it as a Wild West. So when Osman now, in his time period, there is no real, literary tradition. So this story may have happened, may not have happened. The first documentary evidence we have of anything actually comes from quite a little bit after Osman. We have a couple inscriptions from the time of his son Orhan, a few coins from the time of Orhan, but we really start to get into written works about like 60, 70 years after Osman. I'm not sure exactly when this story itself was recorded. In any case, whether it happened or not is actually besides the point, right? Although, yes, I told you last week that historians are interested in analyzing historical sources to be able to piece together events of the past. In this case, what's actually important is the fact that the Ottomans retold this story over and over and over and over again throughout their entire history. Why is this important? Because it shows that in the minds of the Ottomans, their whole empire begins with this man, Osman, and his sheikh. And it is both a figurative and literal marriage of Osman, or of the political order represented by Osman and the religious order represented by Sheikh Edebali, and then his daughter marrying Osman. So the actual factual basis of that story is kind of besides the point. It may have happened, it may have been a back projection. But what's important is that the Ottomans viewed themselves as being a marriage of the religious with the political. Now, we also have to talk about the importance of tasawwuf. I touched on this a little bit last week, but we'll go a little bit more into detail here about this. We have the most important, perhaps the most important Sufi in the history of Muslim history, Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, who lives a couple decades before the foundation of the Ottoman Empire. So Ibn Arabi, just a quick kind of overview. He's born in Muslim Spain, in the city of Murcia, and he actually, there's an account of him meeting Ibn Rushd, who's one of the great fuqaha as well as philosophers of Muslim Spain at that time. He travels east, he spends some time in Mecca and Medina, and then he goes to Syria. His grave is actually in the city of Damascus, but he also spends some time over here in Anatolia. In Anatolia, he has a group of students, notably among them a scholar by the name of Sadruddin al-Qunawi. Ibn Arabi also meets Jalaluddin al-Rumi, who I mentioned a few minutes ago. All of this is to say, Ibn Arabi is hugely, hugely influential in Anatolia in particular. This is really the heartland of where his approach towards tasawwuf really starts to take root, and it is from here, as well as Syria, places like Aleppo and Damascus, that his approach towards tasawwuf starts to spread out to the rest of the Muslim world. Now, some of you may have watched the TV show Ertugrul. Some of you might even be watching this and attending this class because of that show Ertugrul. So that show is supposedly about the father of Osman, Ertugrul. But I hate to break it to you, that show is entirely fiction, right? I know that they do have a disclaimer at the beginning of every episode saying that this is, I think, loosely based on history or something like that. But we know close to nothing about Ertugrul. We don't know that he ever met Ibn Arabi. I watched a couple episodes of that. I don't think I could make it past the second episode, but I think in the first you see Ibn Arabi suddenly show up like out of the forest. He's like this weird kind of New Age Sufi in the way that he's presented in that show. And he becomes like a spiritual advisor to Ertugrul. There is no evidence of that ever happening. As far as I know, there's no evidence of Ertugrul meeting Ibn Arabi in any of Ibn Arabi's writings. Ertugrul didn't know how to write himself. If he existed the way that we understand, the way that we conceive of him existing, he doesn't write about anything about Ibn Arabi. I really appreciate that that show has inspired a lot of people to care about Muslim history and particularly to care about Ibn Arabi. But his portrayal there is just not accurate. It's not the reality, right? He's presented as this weird Turkish kind of forest guy that just kind of comes and speaks in rhyming couplets that are really obscure and nobody can really understand it. That's really not who Ibn Arabi is. He's one of the greatest scholars of our entire tradition. And when we look at him as an influence on the conception of tasawwuf, we see that his impact is enormous. And we see this even in the fact that Osman had a sheikh. And every Ottoman sultan afterwards recognizes the importance and the authority of the Sufi shuyukh over the empire. There's this kind of back and forth understanding between the ulama in general, but specifically the Sufis, in which the Ottoman sultans recognize that these Sufis they have some kind of authority when it comes to the religious matters, that we need to take them very seriously. Yes, the sultan is in charge of the temporal, he's in charge of the political realities on the ground, but the Sufis are engaged in something otherworldly entirely. So there's a huge amount of emphasis placed on the Sufi ulama from very early on in Ottoman history. And we're going to see a little bit of that as we talk today about the establishment of the Ottoman educational system. So now, let's take a look at this map. And we see a lot of different beyliks. Most of these are Turkish beyliks. We talked a little bit about the Mamluks last week. That's not a beylik. That's the Mamluk borderlands over here in Syria. That's connected to Egypt. That's a big empire. Why is it that we're talking, 700 years later about the Ottomans and not about the Karamanids, for example? I mean, the Karamanids are actually a fairly large beylik, and they rule over Konya, which is a huge intellectual as well as political and economic hub. What is unique about the Ottomans? So number one, just geographically looking at where they are placed next to the Byzantine Empire. We talked about how the Byzantines are this kind of constant shadow or constant thorn in the side of the Muslim world for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, by the 14th century, the Byzantines are really crumbling. They still have the city of Constantinople right where I put the laser pointer right now. It's a very, very well defended city, and it's going to last for another 150 years. Spoiler alert, before the Ottomans conquer it. But the rest of the Byzantine lands are pretty much open for conquest. Right, and there's a number of different reasons for that. One of them is that the Byzantine Empire is actually co-opted and kind of, in a way, conquered by the Crusaders at a certain point, which significantly weakens them. And they never really recover after the 13th century. So now, the Ottomans are right on this borderland. So Osman Ghazi is able to lead bands of Turkish warriors. This is not a state yet. This is not an empire, not even close. This is simply a band of warriors that are fighting against this enemy that has been the enemy of Muslims for centuries. And because of the fact that he is successful, he does conquer lands from the Byzantines. He besieges the city that is later known as Bursa. That endears him a lot to a lot of people throughout Anatolia. Now, loyalty, we need to conceive of it in a very different way from how we conceive of it today. The way that we think of citizenship and loyalty, if you are born in the United States, you are an American citizen, and that is part of your identity, and most people feel a sense of loyalty to the United States of America. Similarly, for most other countries, if your parents are from a country, you feel a sense of loyalty very often to that country. But that's not the case here at all. Nobody really feels loyalty to any of these beys. The only time that you feel loyalty to them is if you see that they are successful in doing what needs to be done, like going to war against the Byzantines. So why would you, as a Turkish warrior, right, you've got a horse and you've got a sword and you want to be part of the jihad, you want to be part of a Muslim conquest of non-Muslims. Why would you want to join the Ramazanids over here? The Byzantines are not over here. You're not going to engage in any of the traditional Muslim conquests. You go over to Osman Bey and you join his band of warriors. So because of the fact that Osman is able to conquer, that brings more attention to him because of the fact that he's on the Byzantine borderlands. So loyalty here is very different from the way that we conceive of it today. So long as Osman and his son and his son and his son are successful warriors, so long as they are taking the fight to the Byzantines, they're going to continue to get more support. All right. Don't think of these borders. In fact, if anything, maps like this are a little bit confusing because it shows as if there's a hard border here. There is no border at all. All of these are just bands of nomadic Turks. Another thing that we have to keep in mind is the Mongols are still a factor. They're still wreaking havoc over here in the 1300s, the late 1200s and the early 1300s. They, as I mentioned last week, they do convert to Islam, but their actual manner of behavior and rulership doesn't really change very much. They still kind of act like Mongols. As a result, you have a ton of migration, tons of refugees that leave the lands in Syria and Iraq, and they travel over to the west. As far away as you can get from the Mongols, you find yourself in the lands of the Ottoman Beylik, the Beylik of Osman I. So those are the two main reasons why the Ottomans are able to grow, and we're talking about the Ottoman Empire and not the Karamanid Empire or the Ramazanid Empire or anything like that. So very quickly, we'll go over, not really quickly, but we'll mention the first four Ottoman rulers. It is a mistake to refer to them as sultans from the very beginning, right? We tend to, I mean, the Ottomans are a sultanate, so we tend to think, okay, if the Ottoman sultanate is established by Osman, then he must be a sultan. But really, the first one to take on the title of sultan is Murad I. It is under Osman and really under Orhan that the state begins to be established. So at the very end of Osman's life and the beginning of Orhan's rulership, they conquer the city of Bursa. If you go to the city of Bursa today, it's a beautiful city, first of all. We'll take a look at a couple pictures of the Grand Mosque of Bursa in a minute. It's really wonderful. A lot of people like to go to Istanbul, and that's wonderful. You see a lot of beautiful masajid there, but if you don't go to Bursa, which is like 2 hours away, you're really missing out. But at the beginning of Orhan's reign, when he conquers the city of Bursa, this is really when we start to see the Ottomans begin to take shape, a unique shape as a empire, as a state. They're not an empire yet. And there's three things that I want to point out with regards to Ottoman institutions. Number one is the institution of the madrasa, right? So madrasa is Arabic for school. As you may know, there had been madaris, there had been schools, religious schools throughout Islamic history, right? Very early on in Muslim history, we didn't have the institution of the madrasa the way that we understand it later. The great imams of fiqh, people like Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Shafi'i, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, they didn't go to schools. They studied under scholars, and most of the time these scholars would be teaching in the courtyard of major masajid in cities like Medina or Kufa or Cairo. Well, Fustat later becomes Cairo. under the rule of the Seljuks, we do have the beginnings of the establishment of this idea of a state-sponsored madrasa. But it is really under the Ottomans and really under Orhan that things start to look very different, in that we have schools that are established by the government that are designed specifically for the ulama to run, to create a new class of ulama to serve in that government. So for example, Orhan, when he conquers, after he conquers Bursa a few years later in the year 1331, he establishes what's known as the first Ottoman madrasa in a city called Iznik, and he establishes it for Dawood al-Qaysari, right, or Dawoodi Qaysari, depending on which pronunciation you want to go with. And Dawood al-Qaysari is actually a student of Kashani, who is a student of Ibn Arabi. Again, we're going back to Ibn Arabi being one of the really important figures here in the history of education in the Ottoman Empire. So Qaysari, actually, he writes commentaries on, a commentary on the Fusus of Ibn Arabi, and he is recognized as one of the great scholars of Anatolia. But even though the Ottomans are now establishing madaris, it is really about a century and a half before the Ottoman educational system can really stand on its own 2 feet. And what I mean by that is, although they have schools, people will go to these schools in places like Iznik, in places like Bursa, but then once they finish studying with all the ulama there, they usually would go elsewhere. They would go to Damascus, they would go to Cairo, they would go to Central Asia, places like Bukhara and Samarkand, and study under the ulama there. Because there was this recognition that, yes, this effort of the Ottoman state to establish educational systems is wonderful, it is nothing like what we already have in lands that had been Muslim for hundreds of years, that have very strong intellectual lineages. For example, the one who is considered the first Grand Mufti of the Ottoman Empire, Mullah Shamsuddin Fenari, who dies in the year 1431, so he's a little bit after the time period that we're talking about today. He studies in Bursa, and then he goes and studies in Konya, and then he goes to Cairo a couple times, and he studies under the ulama there. In fact, he has a very good relationship with Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani because of the intellectual tradition that already exists there. And this is a pattern that we see throughout Muslim history. For example, if you go to Malaysia or Indonesia today, obviously you're going to find, those are Muslim countries, and you're going to find tons of Muslim educational institutes. You're going to find madrasas. You're going to find ulama that are going to teach at those madrasas. But early on in the history of those lands, of Malaysia and Indonesia, if you were a well-meaning Muslim who wanted to study the Islamic sciences, you would study under whatever ulama you can find in that region, but then you would have to go back usually to Yemen, right? Yemen is kind of the intellectual fatherland of Indonesia and Malaysia. And it takes hundreds of years before the educational systems in Malaysia and Indonesia are built up to a level that you don't actually have to leave those lands. And this is important for the current context that we find ourselves in today. Very often people want to talk about homegrown scholarship in countries like the United States and European countries and things like that. And that's wonderful. That's a very lofty goal. But you have to keep in mind that Muslims have been in these lands in significant numbers for only a few decades. We've only started to establish madrasas in the past, couple decades. So if that is the case, then you can't just say, okay, well, all the ulama that I'm going to study from are going to be Americans, and everybody has to speak perfect English, and everybody has to, talk about how much they love baseball and apple pie and things like that. Wonderful things. That's not to denigrate those things, obviously, but you have to have some kind of connection to the older lands of the Muslim world. So you'll find in many madaris in the West that most of the ulama, if not all of them, would have studied somewhere in the Muslim world, which is just natural, right? You can't insist that, no, I only want Americans to teach me, or I only want British people to teach me. It does not work that way. And we see this with the Ottoman case. The Ottoman madrasa system does not stand on its own 2 feet until really the mid-15th century, 100 and some odd years after the beginnings of the madrasa. The second, and we're going to talk more about the ilmiya, the whole Ottoman educational system, more next week and the week after that, but just kind of teasing a little bit of that as we talk about the development of this idea of an Ottoman state, Ottoman dawla or davlat. The second institution is this idea of the devshirme. And this is where we get the Janissaries. All right. The Janissaries are the elite troops of the Ottoman Empire. The way that they are recruited is it was essentially a tax on the non-Muslim populations of the Ottoman Empire that they would have to submit a number of young non-Muslim boys to the Ottoman ruler to be trained in the capital to serve the Ottoman Sultan. So they are essentially slave soldiers, like the Mamluks that we talked about last week in Egypt. They're essentially slave soldiers of the Ottoman Sultan. Now, this is another one of those things that in the modern world, everybody wants to kind of really jump on and say, well, how could the Ottomans do this? How could they take children as slaves and things like that? We actually have many cases of people, not many cases, but we have cases of Muslims pretending to be non-Muslims so that their own sons could be drafted into the devshirme. Generally, by and large, you would want your son to be taken as a slave by the Ottoman Sultan. I know that that sounds like a very strange thing to say, but you have to think about what is the norms of that time, and then also what kind of life is a Janissary going to have. You are going to be taken to the Ottoman capital, whether that is Bursa or later Edirne and later Constantinople. You're going to be educated. You're going to learn how to read and write, which is not going to be the case for the vast majority of people in the pre-modern world. You're going to not just learn how to read and write, but you're going to be trained in the Islamic sciences. You're going to be trained in warfare. You're going to be trained in bureaucratic administration. And then when you are an adult, you become an advisor to the Sultan. You become a general in the army. You become an admiral in the navy. You become a bureaucrat working on finance in the Ottoman Empire. These people would, of course, convert to Islam, right? When they're taking these children over to the capital, they're educating them in Islam, so they grow up as Muslims, but they still know their heritage, and they go back to their villages afterwards. They know who their parents are. They know who their families are. So this actually serves as a uniting factor for the Ottoman Empire, because Greeks, Armenians, Bulgarians, Albanians, they can all look to the Ottoman government and say, okay, well, the Sultan is a Turk, but his Grand Vizier is a Greek. His Vizier in charge of the navy might also be Greek, or he might be an Armenian, or he might be a Bulgarian, or whatever it might be. So there is, although the empire is made up of all these different disparate ethnic and linguistic groups, the devshirme does serve to unite many of those people under the Ottoman flag. The third institution that we should talk about is the Ahi. The Ahi is a guild, and it is generally what would happen is if you had a lot of people that are working in the same industry, if you want to join that industry, you would join as an apprentice, right? So you want to become a carpenter, you go and find a carpenter who's been practicing for 30, 40 years, and you train under him. This type of apprenticeship is very standardized by the 13th century, 14th century in Anatolia. And we have these guilds, no matter where you go throughout Ottoman lands, it is understood that there's a carpenter's guild, there's a woodworkers or a metal workers guild. All of these work to kind of standardize practices throughout the empire, but then more importantly, these guilds are very closely tied to the Sufi tariqas. Every guild would have a sheikh. So for example, all of the carpenters would have a particular dhikr that they had to do every day, given from their sheikh. All of the blacksmiths would have a dhikr that is given by their sheikh. These types of things serve to unite people in the empire. And we're going to see, again, spoiler alert, with Bayezid, the empire is actually going to be completely destroyed at the turn of the 15th century, but it's going to be reconstituted, and one of the reasons for that is these three institutions. All three of these serve to unite people or bring people to a sense of loyalty to the Ottoman Empire. Now, Murad I, and well, Bayezid we'll talk about in a second. Murad I, one thing that's really important about him is he significantly expands Muslim or Ottoman control into the Balkans. And in 1389, we have the Battle of Kosovo. This is a major battle between the Ottomans and a united Crusader army. The Crusades are still a thing. It had been a couple hundred years since they had been kicked out of Masjid al-Aqsa by Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. But every now and then you would get a number of Christian countries uniting together to go to war against the Muslims. The most significant one of these as it relates to the Ottomans is the Battle of Kosovo. Murad completely destroys the Crusader army at that battle, but he himself is actually killed, and that's the end of his reign. This is an important battle from the perspective of modern nationalism, because today Balkan groups, particularly Serbs, look at the Battle of Kosovo as the worst thing that's ever happened in their history. They say this is the beginning of us being conquered by other people, despite the fact that the Serbs had previously been part of the Byzantine Empire and a number of different major states in that region. That is now seen as like the big bad thing that's happened in their history, the Battle of Kosovo. Before we talk about Bayezid, and we have 10 minutes left, I just want to take a look at a few of the pictures of the Ulu Jame, the Grand Mosque of Bursa. As I mentioned, most people when they go to Turkey, they go and look at the beautiful Masajid of Istanbul, which is wonderful. They are absolutely beautiful, but you go to Bursa and you get a completely different architectural sense. We'll talk a little bit more about architecture next week, and we're going to see how the Ottomans really incorporate a lot of Byzantine architectural styles into their own. But here we see something that's completely unique in Bursa, and it is really a melding of Byzantine as well as Seljuk and local architectural forms, obviously under the united banner of Islam. And we see these beautiful calligraphic pieces, Allahu Nurun ala Nur. This one is really interesting because it says Ra'sul Hikmah Makhafat Allah, the pinnacle or the head of wisdom is fear of Allah. And this was a huge calligraphic piece that was put right next to where the Sultan himself would pray in this masjid, which is really interesting to see. I mean, the Ottomans were very particular about the way that they thought of things like this. Now, let's talk about Bayezid. Now, with most Ottoman sultans, they're given, either at their time or a little bit later, they're given a nickname. So, for example, Mehmet II, who conquers Constantinople, he's known as Fatih, right, which is Arabic and Turkish for conqueror. Suleiman, who rules in the mid-16th century, he's known as Qanuni, right, because he reforms the legal code of the Ottoman Empire. Bayezid, he is the fourth Ottoman ruler. He rules from 1389 to 1402. He is given the nickname of Yildirim. Yildirim is Turkish for thunderbolt. And the reason that he is given that nickname is because he would spend half of the year in the European territories fighting against crusaders and fighting against various non-Muslim groups. And then the other half of the year, he would be conquering lands in Anatolia from other Turkish principalities. So in the summer, he's up here. In the winter, he's down here. And he'd go back and forth, back and forth. His own soldiers gave him the nickname of Thunderbolt. Now, he was a very effective conqueror. And he conquered most of Anatolia, most of the rest of these Turkish beyliks. And a lot of these Turkish beyliks started, understandably, to get pretty upset about this. And they look to the east for some help. Now, who rules in the east at this time? A Turco-Mongol warlord by the name of Timur, also known as Tamerlane or Timur-Leng, a number of different names that he's given throughout history. Now, if you know anything about Timur, he is one of the most ruthless warlords in Muslim history. He is a Muslim. He's a Turco-Mongol Muslim. He claims some form of descent, I believe, through his mother from Chinggis Khan. But his pattern of conquest is the traditional Mongol pattern of conquest, which is just destroy everything that you see. Now, this might be something some people attending this class might not necessarily like me saying that, because he is, in modern Uzbekistan, he's kind of considered like the George Washington figure of that country. He's considered like the major founder of the country. The Uzbeks tend to trace their political lineage to him, because he ruled out of Samarkand, which is in modern-day Uzbekistan, and everywhere he went, he conquered Delhi, for example, he conquered Aleppo, he conquered Damascus, he conquered pretty much all of modern-day Iran. He would usually kind of destroy the city, and then, except for the craftsmen, right, the artisans and those guys, he would send them back to Samarkand. And because of that, Samarkand is a very beautiful city even today, We have a lot of beautiful masajid and madrasas and mausoleums and things like that were built by people from Delhi, from Syria, from Persia. And as a result, I mean, those are still beautiful tourist attractions today. At the time, though, Timur really was not very well liked, but he was very effective. And everybody knew that he was very, very good at conquering other people. If you're interested in an account of, a very interesting account of somebody meeting Timur, look up Ibn Khaldun meeting Timur. If you just Google that, you should come across a translation of Ibn Khaldun, the same person we talked about earlier who wrote the Muqaddimah. He worked for the Mamluks. The Mamluks were at war with Timur, and he was in Damascus with the Mamluk Sultan. In the middle of the night, the Mamluk Sultan and his friend and his advisors, they flee the city when Timur is coming. They don't bother telling Ibn Khaldun. He wakes up in the morning and suddenly he's in charge of the entire city, and Timur is coming to conquer it. And he actually gets to meet with Timur, and he spends a few days with him, and Timur asks him, you know, I hear that you're from the Maghrib. I hear you're from North Africa. I've never heard of those lands. I would really like to visit them sometime. So if you could just draw me a map and a quick geographic description of the best ways to get through those lands, I would really appreciate it. And, you know, if you're standing in front of this major warlord, you don't really tell him no. And Ibn Khaldun does do that. And it's a fascinating account. I won't ruin it for anybody who wants to look it up and read it. It's really, really interesting. He finds a way to get away from Timur. But the thing that we take away from this is that Timur is just ruthless. You don't mess with the Timurids. Later, from his lineage, we do get Muhammad Babur, who founds the Mughal Empire in India. So keep that in mind. But at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, we have Bayezid now no longer fighting against the other beyliks of Anatolia. Those guys have now turned to Timur and said, hey, we need your help. And Timur comes to Anatolia. They meet at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, and the entire Ottoman army is just destroyed. All right. Bayezid himself is taken prisoner by Timur, and he's taken all the way to Samarkand, where he dies probably that year or a year later. And what Timur does is he pits Bayezid's 4 sons. I think Sulaiman, Isa, Muhammad, and another one who's named after a prophet, I believe, maybe Musa. These 4 sons are each given a portion of the Ottoman Empire, and Timur tells them, just go to war and knock yourselves out. I don't care what you guys do. And this is known as the Ottoman interregnum. Let's go back to Ibn Khaldun, who we just talked about. How long does he say that every empire lasts? Around 100 years. What is the traditional date of the foundation of the Ottoman Empire? 1299. Now we're at 1402. It's been 100 years. The empire has been completely, essentially wiped off the map. And the Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid, has been taken prisoner, and he either commits suicide or is killed by Timur within a few months. And his sons are fighting over. There is no Ottoman Empire anymore. So it looks like Ibn Khaldun's theory holds true. As you know, probably, the Ottoman Empire does not really end in 1402. We're going to see it last for a few centuries afterwards, but that's going to be where we pick up next week, inshallah. How does the empire come back together under one of Bayezid's sons, Mehmet, or Muhammad I, Mehmet Chalabi, who defeats his brothers and reconstitutes the empire along pretty much the same lines as it was under his father and grandfather, Bayezid and Murad I. So we're really now starting to get into the heart of the empire. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of where we're going to go in the next couple of weeks. Next week, we're going to talk about the mid-15th century, particularly the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople, of which you may be aware there's the famous hadith that Muslims will conquer Constantinople, and what a wonderful ruler that will be, and what a wonderful army that will be. And the Ottomans obviously are going to look at Constantinople through that lens for 150 years until they finally do catch up to it. And then the week after that, we'll get into the what's considered the golden age of the Ottoman Empire, the mid-16th century under Yavuz Selim and Sultan Sulaiman Qanuni, inshallah. So jazakumullah khair for attending, inshallah. This is beneficial for everybody. We'll pick up next week, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.